We're going to put together the second piece of the puzzle that explains how the body moves, how movement at joints is accomplished. We've talked about the skeleton and bone tissue, that it provides support and protects, that bones articulating together make a joint or allow movement, but movement won't occur without the action of muscles at those joints. You need both ingredients to be able to produce movement. Now, I want to be specific that we're not looking at the metabolism of muscle. We're not looking at the internal structure of muscle in this section. We will come back to that later. I only want to present muscle here as the effector tissue, the mover, the thing that accomplishes or contributes to movement. How does muscle work in producing a movement? It shouldn't be a surprise that muscles contract. Muscles, skeletal muscles, can contract voluntarily. You generate force. And those muscles should be, in large part, they're mostly connected to bones at either end. The large majority of muscles are connected at either end to bones. There are many different shapes, though, and I'll touch on these at the end. But let's assume one long linear string, one muscle with two endpoints. They contract, they shorten, they exert force through tendons that connect to bones. Tendons connect skeletal muscle to bone. These aren't like ligaments. Ligaments are different. They connect bone to bone. They help to secure the joints. We saw these last class. Tendons specifically interface between bone and muscle. And we'll look at what tendons are made of when we talk about the structure of skeletal muscle, when we get in depth about that tissue later on. But it is a projection of all the coverings of the muscle tissue that connects to or is knitted into bone to allow it to connect to it properly. So muscles contract, muscles shorten, muscles generate force. They only shorten. You can't contract a muscle and lengthen it. As much as you feel like you're slouching over in your seat and you straighten and erect your spine properly and get good posture, you're not lengthening the muscles. You're contracting, you're shortening muscles that bring your spine into proper alignment. Muscles only shorten. They only create a pull. Muscles do not lengthen. Actively, you can't contract them to make them longer. They don't push. They only create a pull. And so with that in mind, one really useful way to start to understand how muscle creates force at a joint is to, in lab, when you're in lab, or in your own imagination, or with the 3D app, think of the muscle as an elastic band. An elastic band that's stretched, and when you release it or it recoils, it creates force or tension and brings those 2 points together. A muscle is just like an elastic band when it contracts. The 2 endpoints come together. Those 2 points are the points of connection, or the origin and insertion of that muscle. The origin and the insertion. When we start to consider muscles and their names, we start to list them, we think about what actions they perform, we'll start to think of what their blood supply is and what nerves turn them on. Other important information about those muscles are their origin and insertion, the points of connection of those muscles to bone. Now, in order for a muscle to create movement, that muscle needs to span a joint. If you only have a muscle Sure, it has two attachment points, but it's only on one bone and it doesn't span a joint. All it would do when it contracted was try to compress the bone. The bone can't move very easily. No motion would occur. In order for motion to occur, the muscle has to cross over a joint or a point of articulation. Joints allow movement to occur. And if that muscle crosses over top of that joint, as soon as the elastic band recoils and those ends get pulled together, you're going to see movement occur at that point of articulation, at that joint. So biceps are a really nice, easy muscle to think about. You can point to them on yourself as you're writing. You can imagine them working and contracting. You can see them moving your arm. So it's a really nice example to put up on the screen. You can imagine the point just past the elbow joint as it contracts and shortens, brings the muscle together and raises the forearm. It flexes the elbow joint and closes that joint angle. Now, the origin and insertion might seem arbitrary. There's 2 points of attachment, 2 bones. Which is which? The general rule is that the stationary bone, the bone that doesn't move, the point of attachment on the stationary bone is the origin. And where the muscle connects on the bone that does move when it contracts is the insertion. So if you're looking at the biceps in this example, the origin is at the superior aspect of this diagram, the acromion process of the scapula. You don't need to know that yet. We'll get into it. And it extends all the way through the upper arm and connects on the coronoid process of the radius or ulna. I actually forget right now, but we'll get there. As these 2 points come closer together, the only way that they can do that is if there's movement in the forearm. That is the insertion. The joint angle closes. Biceps provide flexion of the elbow. So if you were to extend the elbow, I want you to notice while we're on this slide, the biceps wouldn't be involved. You wouldn't contract the biceps to extend the elbow. The biceps would need to allow that to occur. They can't be active at the same time. But the action would be achieved by the triceps on the back of the arm as they pull the forearm back inferior on this picture. They extend the joint and open that joint angle. Every joint in the body works according to a somewhat similar premise as this. 2 attachment points that span a joint that allow movement of those 2 bones, articulation of the 2 bones at that joint, 2 or more bones. And whether a joint will open or close, whether the muscle will be able to produce movement or not, all just depends on simple forces at the joint. I'll prepare you for biomechanics, where this will come back to haunt you, and you'll learn a lot about force and torque and moment and have to memorize a bunch of equations. Whether movement occurs only depends on force. So, does the muscle produce enough force to overcome whatever force is in opposition? Does the muscle produce a greater force than the force that opposes movement at that joint? So the force that's generated by the muscle would be this arrow along the belly of the muscle, the effort of contraction. You can have a light contraction, you can have a medium contraction, you can have a maximal contraction, and we talked about summation, sending signals rapidly. There's temporal summation, spatial summation that can turn the muscle on more, so you have gradual increases in the strength of contraction. Let me catch back up here. The point of movement, the point of articulation is called the fulcrum. We're not going to worry too much about these names now. You will see them in biomechanics again, but I use that because that point just allows rotation. Movement occurs at the arm distal to the fulcrum. The effort is applied through the muscle to wherever it attaches. And then the force that opposes the muscle, in this case, is any weight being held in the hand and the weight of the forearm. Right? If I'm holding my arm out like this, there's some influence of gravity trying to pull my arm down. My biceps right now are able to match that force. It's matching that force because there's no movement. If I want to move my arm, then I can add force. I can create a greater contraction force in my bicep, close that joint angle. Or I can lessen the effort and my arm would fall. The muscle will only shorten, it will only contract and shorten if the effort is greater than the opposing load. Of course. Your biceps will only, or your forearm will only flex, your elbow will only flex if the force at the biceps is greater than the opposing load. And this is not a problem normally, but it comes into play when you think about holding a dumbbell then. You're doing, what you're doing when you're holding a dumbbell is increasing the opposition to movement. At some point, and this is different for everyone, the contraction force generated by the bicep won't be enough. There won't be the capacity to shorten the joint. And so you won't get any movement. This is an example of a lever. This is a really easy to understand lever. All of the force that closes the forearm is applied right here, very close to the pivot point, which actually makes this a very difficult lever to move. You'll learn why that is in biomechanics, but it would be much easier to flex the elbow if the biceps attached at the wrist. So much easier. There are other types of levers in the body. The same points hold true. Muscle will only shorten when it contracts, and movement will only occur if the force is greater than the oppositional load. There are a couple different kinds of levers, first class, second class, and third class levers. We don't need to know why they're named that way. Just notice that they're different. Notice the position of the effort in relation to the fulcrum and the load. In the first class lever, they are separated by the fulcrum. In the second class lever, the load is between the effort and the fulcrum. And in the third class lever, the load is outside on the other end of the effort and the fulcrum. This is not so important for our class. Just understand that there are multiple types of levers. What we want to know moving forward is that muscles generate force, they shorten when they contract, and movement only occurs if the force is greater than the load. In each of these cases, it's easy to imagine how movement might occur. Each of these three examples is one simple linear muscle or set of muscles. The biceps in a straight line. We talked about that at length. The calves in a straight line. The soleus and the gastrocnemius. We've talked about, or we haven't talked about that yet, but we will. And then splenius or the scalenes, we'll talk about those a little bit later on. They are mostly in a straight line. They attach top to bottom, contraction again in a straight line. Not all muscles are arranged in that linear fashion. And so the way that the muscle fibers are arranged changes how the muscle works. The fibers within a muscle are arranged into groups or bunches called fascicles. And we've seen that word before when we looked at the internal anatomy of a nerve. Bunches of neurons together was a fascicle. Muscles are actually arranged very similarly to nerves, and the wrappings even have similar names to the wrappings around the individual portions of a nerve. That's foreshadowing. We'll see that later. So the fibers are arranged in fascicles, and in all the examples that we've seen so far, those fascicles are all parallel. They all work or are pointed in the same direction. Different muscles in the body will have them in different arrangements, though. The simplest is linear. Some of them might fan, and you'll have fascicles going at different degree angles from each other. Some muscles are circular. You saw that in lab when you learned about the eye. Circular muscles will simply contract, or of course they contract. Circular muscles will squeeze and shorten. They'll make the hole, the size of the hole, smaller. That action has a lot of really important use when we get to the digestive system. And depending on whether these bundles are all lined up together or not, will allow the muscle to function differently. If they're all lined up together, they're all working in the same direction, they're all contributing force towards movement. And so generally, you can produce a lot of power in those linear muscles where all the fascicles are arranged together. When all the fascicles are arranged in line with each other too, the point-to-point distance can shorten a lot more. You get much more range of motion with muscles that are linear. When we look at some examples coming up in 2 or 3 slides, we'll see all the varying different types of muscles, and you can imagine how shortening the muscle fibers at different degree angles would affect the range of motion of that muscle. So all the fibers grouped together in a fascicle, depending on how they're arranged, will allow that muscle to shorten. If they're all lined up together, shortening is powerful, and it's to a high degree. There's a large amount of movement or a large amount of range of motion. Now, something that I alluded to already today and that we spent time talking about when we mentioned reflexes are that while we talk about individual muscles doing a job, movement is not individual. Movement at a joint, even at the elbow, is not only the action of one singular muscle. Movement occurs through the actions of groups of muscles. Sure, there are main players, there are main characters at movement of the elbow or movement of any joint, but there are supporting players as well. Not only supporting players, but there are opposing players. And so the groups of muscles at a given joint that allow movement are the agonist or the prime mover, the muscle that does most of the work and generates most of the contractile force. In the case of elbow flexion, that's the biceps brachii. That is the prime mover The biceps are the main muscle that flexes the elbow. There are synergist muscles. These are the supporting muscles. They're muscles that will span the same joint, maybe at a different angle, or maybe they're smaller. They'll support the movement at that muscle, but they're not going to provide the majority of the contraction effort. In the case of the elbow, that's the brachioradialis. It's a different muscle that also spans the elbow that we haven't looked at yet, and it's actually not even on this slide. If you saw it, it would connect from where this line points at the humerus down towards the wrist. It still spans the elbow joint, and it supports flexion at the elbow, but it's not the primary mover. The biceps are the primary mover. The agonist, the synergist work together to accomplish movement. The antagonist would oppose movement. The antagonist in this case are the triceps muscles on the back of the upper arm. They are the muscles that are arranged to perform the opposite action. Every joint has an antagonist. For there to be movement, the antagonist has to be off. It has to permit movement to occur. If both groups of muscles were active at the same time, nothing would happen. You would simply sit there flexing your entire upper arm and no movement would occur at the elbow. For movement to occur, the antagonist has to be deactivated. And this is true of every joint in the body. There are prime movers, synergists, and antagonists. Let me just briefly introduce some of the other shapes of muscles and broaden your horizons a little bit. We've talked about these linear types along the top, the parallel and fusiform muscles. Fusiform is simply a fancy name for muscle that bulges in the middle. There's more muscle tissue in the middle, allowing a greater contractile force. And generally that's true of any muscle. The more fiber there is, the more force that can be produced. So you compare a muscle like the biceps in the arm to the quadriceps in the leg. Quadriceps have a lot more muscle mass and therefore can produce a lot more force. The size is inherently related to the amount of force that can be produced. And so these linear muscles are pretty easy to understand. They all contract and bring the two endpoints together. Some other muscles that are a bit more difficult to understand, you have the fan-shaped muscle. Latissimus dorsi is a fan-shaped muscle. Some of the muscles of the rotator cuffs are fan-shaped. When these fibers contract, the entire wide border on the left-hand side is pulled towards one specific point. These muscles aren't lined up exactly parallel. They still work to shorten and pull the border on the left towards the point on the right, but the force is distributed. It diffuses across that wider border. Circular muscles here. Sphincters are circular. Sphincters contract and close. The hole in the middle serves various different functions depending on where the sphincter is in the body. We'll learn about many different kinds of sphincters. Muscles in the eye are sphincters as well. As those muscles contract, you can see there's only one tendon, one white area. So bringing those 2 points together, there aren't 2 points to bring together, but if you imagine the rubber band that was stretched, recoiling and returning to normal, the circle just gets smaller and everything recoils and comes together. So a few different types of muscles. The orientation of the muscle fibers dictates what direction the contraction occurs and dictates how much force can be applied through that axis by the muscle. There are a few different options down here as we get to a couple different orientations, but we'll approach those when we talk about specific cases like the deltoids or the quadriceps. I'll highlight some differences in the structure of those muscles when we get there. So just a brief primer on muscles. We're not looking at their structure so much. We're not looking at how they contract, the energy they use to contract, the types of internal machinery that allow contraction. That's coming up. We're just looking at the overall shape and acknowledging that they shorten when they're activated. Depending on how they're shaped, that shortening can have a few different roles. The easiest to understand are the linear parallel fibers of a basic fusiform or parallel muscle. When muscles contract across a joint, movement occurs. Joints allow movement. Synovial joints specifically allow movement. The other two types of joints do not. We can classify them based on structure and function, like we discussed at length last class. Fibrous joints, cartilaginous joints allow little to no movement. Synovial joints allow a lot of movement, a lot of articulation. So those are the ones that we tend to focus on. We tend to focus on synovial joints when we think about resistance exercises or cycling and running or movement of the human body. We tend to focus on synovial joints. Those are the free moving joints, the only ones that have a capsule, a fibrous capsule that surrounds the joint, contains synovial fluid, whose job is to lubricate those two surfaces and reduce friction. Depending on how those joints are set up, they could be fairly simple, like I suppose the elbow, which still isn't really that simple, but our understanding right now is that it's fairly simple. It opens and closes like a hinge. Depending on how the bones are set up, it dictates range of motion and the type of motion that occurs. It can be fairly simple or somewhat more complex. The point where the bones meet is the fulcrum or the pivot point. The point where the muscle connects to bone is where the effort of contraction is added. And then load can occur anywhere along the bone, wherever that load is placed or held, where a dumbbell is held in the hand or a strap is attached to the arm, or any number of different ways that a load can be attached. A load will oppose motion. The joint will only move or articulate if the force is greater than the load. And so with that thinking in place, there's a one-to-one relationship. You can think if you're holding 50 pounds worth of iron or dumbbell in your hand, the only way that the joint would close is if your muscle was able to produce 50 pounds or more worth of force. So you can get a brief unofficial assessment of the force generation of a muscle by being able to measure how much opposition there is to the movement of that muscle. We're not calling it early today. I want to introduce the next section real quick. I'm spoiling you guys by calling it early on too many of these class days. So, we understand bone tissue, we understand the skeleton, we understand joints. Now we have an introduction to how muscles will contract and shorten and then allow movement or produce movement at those joints. What we're starting in this section is our exploration of the various joints in the body, of the muscles, of the specific bones, origins, insertions, innervation, blood supply, of the skeleton and the musculature in the body. We're exploring the body as a whole. And we're starting with the torso, the center of mass, the thoracic cage, and the vertebral column. Center of mass of the body. So what we're going to do in this section, we did spend a little bit of time on this when we talked about the spinal cord. Remember, I alluded to vertebrae. We talked about the spinal nerves passing through the holes created by the vertebrae. We're going to look at how to identify specific vertebrae. The vertebrae stack one on top of each other with discs in between to make up the vertebral column. And they give rise to articulations with the ribs that form the entire thoracic cage. And this is a very important structure that contains the heart and the lungs, provides attachment points for muscles of breathing, the diaphragm, the intercostals, can support and protect some of the digestive system, the liver. A lot of the major organs in the body are housed within the thoracic cage and in the torso. So we're going to talk about the abdominopelvic cavity, the thoracic cage, the vertebrae, as we go through this section. So we're going to look at the bones first, and then we are going to add the muscles on top. When we have that framework, we're going to add the important muscles that accomplish the job of breathing or the job of helping you stand up and sit up straight. The actions of interest, the major actions of interest that we're looking at in this section. There are other muscles. We're not going to go in depth with an exhaustive list in any of these sections coming up. There are too many muscles to list. The approach that I have here is, what are the main bones that create the structure? What are the actions that we want to understand? And what are the muscles that execute that action, that allow that action to occur? So here, breathing, standing are the actions that we want to understand. So standing upright, largely possible because of the stacked nature of the vertebral column. Standing upright, twisting side to side, bending over, hyperextending, flexing forward, all actions that can be accomplished at the vertebral column. So we'll call it the vertebral column or the spinal column. You can see all the vertebrae listed and numbered here in sequence. The sequences start over again for a reason that we'll see coming up shortly. The backbone, the spine, these are all names that refer to the same thing, the vertebral column shown here. 26 vertebrae, and this number is fixed. There won't be more or less. There shouldn't be more or less. 26 vertebrae, distinct separate vertebrae. All of these numbered vertebrae are what I'm including in that sum total of 26. There is a special region down near the bottom of the spinal cord that some people will include in that number, but these fuse together during development, so we don't often count them. There are 5 regions. That's what explains the sequences of the numbers, that they start over. You can see the regions listed over here on the right-hand side: cervical, thoracic, lumbar, sacral, and coccygeal regions of the vertebral column. Its number one job is to protect the spinal cord and allow the distribution of spinal nerves at many different levels in the body. But not only protecting the spinal cord, if that were its only job, it would simply be a long fused tube. It has to protect the spinal cord while allowing a certain degree of movement. Rotation, flexibility of the torso and the vertebral column. It needs to be somewhat flexible in its ability to protect the spinal cord. Now we look at it head on here and it looks somewhat bland. There are a number of different projections and there's some fillings sandwiched between all of these vertebrae. We don't really know what those are yet. There's different shapes and sizes. They seem to grow in thickness as you head inferior through the spinal cord. When we turn it to the side, it looks a little bit more interesting. There's a bit of shape that we can see. It's not so linear. The spinal cord has a natural curve, or multiple natural curves to it. And these change over the course of development. There are primary and secondary curves in the adult spinal cord. When you start out as a fetus and a newborn, the spinal cord, or the vertebral column, is only curved in one direction. It's concave onwards. It's only curved in one direction. But as you grow and develop, secondary curves form in the opposite direction. So primary curves are the curves of the spinal cord that retain their original orientation. Number 2 and number 4 on the slide are primary curves. It's the same curve as you're born with. Concave, pointing towards the front of the body. Secondary curves develop as you grow. The number 1 and number 3, the cervical and lumbar curves, occur as you grow and develop. These are convex when looked at from the front. They simply point in the other direction. Secondary curves are not the curves that we have as an embryo or a newborn. They develop as we grow and mature. So primary curves, thoracic and sacral. Secondary curves, cervical and lumbar. What allows curves to happen? What allows movement to happen between the vertebrae? How is it possible that this really intricate arrangement of bones with all of these pointy processes can ever move and articulate in an organized manner? We're going to look at that when we come back to class tomorrow. The answer to that question I'll have for you right away as class starts. Have a great Thursday. I'll see you tomorrow.